Long before the screams and the sleepless nights, there was only silence. The kind of silence that seemed too perfect. The house stood alone at the edge of the woods, surrounded by tall grass and trees that never stopped swaying, even when there was no wind. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful in photos, the kind of place people dreamed of escaping to. But dreams are tricky. Sometimes they lead you straight into the heart of something you were never meant to find. Mark and Eliza believed they were making the best decision of their lives. After years of city life and all the chaos that came with it, they longed for stillness. Their daughter Lily was growing fast, and they wanted her to know more than concrete walls and flashing lights. They wanted nature. They wanted space. Most of all, they wanted peace. The house was old, older than it looked in the photos. Ivy crawled up one side of the stone walls. The wooden floors creaked under the weight of every step, and the windows groaned slightly when the breeze rolled through. Still, there was beauty in its wear. It had character, charm. It felt like a place that held stories in its walls. Lily was full of joy as she explored every corner. She twirled in empty rooms and laughed at the echo of her own voice. She chose the upstairs bedroom with a view of the woods. It became hers in an instant, filled with stuffed animals, picture books, and the pink blanket she could never sleep without. That first night, the family sat together by the fireplace, feeling lucky. The stars outside were brighter than anything they had ever seen in the city. It was the kind of night they had always imagined. What they could not imagine was what lay hidden in the silence. What they could not feel was the faint stir of something ancient beneath their floor. Something watching, something waiting. The attic was not part of the plan. It was dusty, dim, and filled with forgotten things left by the previous owners. Mark had gone up there only to check for leaks, but Lily had followed behind him, curious and wide-eyed. The air was thick, filled with the smell of old wood, and something else he couldn't place. Something faint and strange. Lily wandered through the clutter as if drawn by an invisible thread. Near the back wall, half buried under a tattered blanket, she found it. A teddy bear, worn but intact. Its fur was dark brown, though it looked like it had once been lighter. One of its button eyes was chipped, and the stitching around its mouth had come slightly undone, giving it a lopsided expression. There was something unsettling about the way it stared, yet Lily picked it up without hesitation and hugged it tightly against her chest. Mark laughed nervously and tried to offer her one of her newer toys instead, but she shook her head. She wanted the bear. That night, she named it Mr. Brownie and carried it everywhere she went. During dinner, it sat beside her. During bedtime, she tucked it in under the covers next to her. Eliza raised an eyebrow at the bear's worn look, but decided it was harmless. Children often found comfort in the strangest things. They told themselves it was sweet, harmless. Maybe even a sign that Lily was adjusting well to the new environment. It was just an old stuffed toy. That was all. Nothing more. But they didn't see the way Lily stared into its face before falling asleep. They didn't notice how she stopped playing with her other toys. And they certainly didn't hear the soft sound that came from her room later that night. A low, rumbling sound, like a growl. Barely loud enough to register, but enough to raise the hair on the back of Mark's neck as he paused halfway down the stairs. It started just past midnight. The house was still, the kind of silence that settles over a remote countryside when the wind has stopped and every creature has gone to sleep. Mark lay in bed, his eyes half closed when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, low, deep, almost like the purr of a large animal but more guttural. A growl. He sat up, unsure if he had imagined it. Eliza stirred beside him, sensing his tension. Then they both heard it again. This time it was louder, coming from the direction of Lily's room. Mark tried to convince himself it was just an animal outside. Maybe a wild dog. Maybe the wind rolling through the trees in a strange way. But deep down, he knew that explanation no longer made sense. The windows were always shut. The sounds were too close, too real. Lily began to change. Her bright energy dulled. The rosy color in her cheeks faded, leaving her pale and quiet. She stopped asking to go outside. Her laughter, once constant, disappeared. At breakfast, she picked at her food without a word. She no longer played with her blocks or read her picture books. She clung to the bear, holding it close even when it was hot outside. Always holding it, never letting go. Eliza noticed the dark circles under her daughter's eyes. Lily looked like she had not truly slept in days. The joy that once lit up her face had vanished, replaced by something heavy and distant. She barely spoke anymore, and when she did, her words felt hollow. The parents started checking every part of the house. They inspected the walls, the attic, the basement. They set traps, thinking maybe a raccoon had gotten in. Mark walked the perimeter of the property every evening before sunset. He found nothing. No prints, no damage. Nothing that explained the sounds that haunted the night. Eliza began keeping a notepad by the bed, recording every time the growl happened. There was no pattern. Sometimes it came early in the night, sometimes just before dawn. But it always came. The same deep, unnatural sound. Always near their child. Always near that bear. They wanted to believe it was just nightmares. Just a child's imagination. But children's imaginations did not leave real fear in the hearts of grown adults. And this fear was growing. It began with a single scratch, a thin, jagged line across the hallway wall just outside Lily's room. Mark noticed it one morning and assumed Lily had dragged a toy too hard against the plaster. But the next day, there were more. Not just one or two, but a cluster of marks etched into the wall like something with claws had tried to tear its way out, or in. They painted over them, trying to forget. The next morning, the scratches were back, deeper this time. Then came the cold. It wasn't the kind of chill that came from drafty windows or old pipes. This cold settled into the bones. It hovered outside Lily's room like a fog that would not lift. Every time Eliza walked past her daughter's door, she felt her skin prickle. The air was always heavier there, and her breath sometimes turned white, even when the heater ran all night. The family dog, a golden retriever named Milo, had always been gentle and fearless. But now he refused to go upstairs. He would stop at the bottom step, whine softly and back away. If they tried to coax him up, he would bark once and run to the back door. It was as if something unseen was standing guard up there, something only he could sense. Worried it might be a hidden animal or some pest infestation, Mark called a local vet to check Milo for any illness. The dog was perfectly healthy. They called in a pest control expert who searched the attic, the walls, the crawl space. Nothing. No signs of rodents, no droppings, no nests, no movement. The house, they were told, was completely clear. But the night said otherwise. The growls continued. The cold deepened. And now there were other sounds. Scraping, clicking, a faint whisper that could almost be mistaken for breathing. Eliza stopped sleeping altogether. She sat up at night with her eyes locked on the baby monitor, watching the soft rise and fall of her daughter's chest, listening for anything out of the ordinary. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like it was watching them, waiting, and whatever it was getting stronger. Eliza could no longer ignore the unease that wrapped around her every time she looked at Lily's room. The house had become something unfamiliar. The cheerful paint, the cozy furniture, the warmth they had tried to bring in, all felt like a thin curtain stretched over something much darker. And that darkness seemed to center around the bear. Driven by a need to understand, Eliza turned to the only place that still held answers, the village library. Tucked inside a small brick building near the center of town, the library kept old property records and clippings from local newspapers. Eliza searched the archives for anything connected to their address. She didn't expect to find much. What she found instead turned her blood cold. Decades earlier, another family had lived in the same house. A man, a woman, and their 5-year-old son. The boy had been found dead in his bed one winter morning. No signs of injury, no illness, just lifeless. Asleep with his arms wrapped around a teddy bear. The article described the death as sudden and unexplainable. The parents had told neighbors that strange things had happened in the weeks before. Noises in the night, the child whispering to someone who wasn't there, pets behaving strangely. They tried to get help, but no one believed them. Eventually, they moved away. The house had stood empty for years before it was listed again. Eliza sat in the library with the newspaper clippings spread before her. The boy's face looked back at her from a grainy black and white photo. His eyes were wide and happy, his arms clutching a bear that looked painfully familiar. Her fingers trembled as she traced the shape of it in the image. It was the same bear. The cold she had felt outside Lily's door now sank into her chest. This wasn't about dreams or fear of change. This wasn't about adjusting to a new home. Something had been waiting in that attic, waiting for another child to hold it, another child to whisper to, another child to keep it alive. She left the library with the pages folded under her arm and fear wrapped tight around her heart. Something had started again, and this time it had found Lily. Eliza didn't speak much after returning from the library. Her hands trembled as she showed Mark the newspaper article, the picture of the boy and the bear. He read the story in silence, his face growing pale with each line. They both knew something was terribly wrong. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were forming a clear picture, one that neither of them wanted to believe. That night, Mark set up a camera and baby monitor in Lily's room. He told himself it was just for peace of mind, but deep down he feared what they might see. The monitor showed a soft grayscale image of Lily's bed. She was asleep, as always, with Mr. Brownie tucked under her arm. Her breathing was even. The room was still. For hours, nothing happened. They sat in the living room staring at the screen, the only sound in the house the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Then at just past 2 in the morning, something changed. The bear moved. It was not a shift or a slump the way stuffed toys sometimes fall. It turned its head, slowly, deliberately, toward the camera, toward them. Mark froze. Eliza gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. The image trembled slightly, not from the camera, but from something heavier. A deep, rumbling growl filled the speakers of the monitor. It was not an animal's growl. It was deeper than anything they had heard before. It shook the air, filled the room, and seemed to come from something far older than they could comprehend. Lily didn't wake. She simply tightened her grip on the bear, her body curling around it like it was her only protection. But the bear kept moving. Its limbs twitched. Its chest rose and fell, slow and heavy, like it was breathing. In the morning, they took the recording to the only person in town who might understand, a retired historian who had spent decades studying local folklore. He watched the video with a grim expression, then disappeared into the back room of his cottage. When he returned, he was holding a leather-bound book filled with stories few had ever read. The bear, he explained, was not just a toy, it was a vessel. Years ago, it had belonged to a traveling man who practiced dark rituals. He believed he could trap spirits inside objects. The bear had once been part of his collection. After the man died under strange circumstances, the items were scattered. Most were destroyed, but some were lost. And one had been waiting. The historian gave them a name. A woman who lived far beyond the village, deep in the forested hills where no roads were paved and cell signals disappeared. She was known by few, trusted by even fewer. Her knowledge came not from books, but from something older, something passed down in silence. People called her the keeper of forgotten things. Mark and Eliza drove there without hesitation. Lily stayed with a neighbor, unaware of the bear now locked inside a box and placed in the car trunk. Even boxed, it felt heavy, not from weight, but from something unseen. Eliza couldn't help but glance at the rear-view mirror again and again, certain it would burst free. The woman welcomed them without words. Her home was filled with objects that hummed with strange energy, bottles sealed with wax, symbols etched into wood, bones tied with string. She took the box, placed it on a low table, and studied it without touching. Her eyes did not blink as she listened to their story. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. This was not an ordinary object. It was a binding, a prison for something that had once belonged to another world. Breaking it would not be simple. It would require risk. It would require their presence. That night, under her guidance, they began the ritual. The bear was placed in a circle drawn with ash. Candles flickered violently, as if reacting to something no one could see. The woman chanted in a language neither of them recognized, her hands moving in slow, precise gestures. The growling returned, louder than ever. The walls trembled. The candles went out and lit again without warning. Mark held Eliza's hand so tightly his fingers turned white. The bear writhed within the circle. Its fur seemed to pulse like it was alive. Then came a sound that was not a growl but a scream. Not human, not animal. just raw, ancient rage. The woman threw a final handful of salt into the circle. The bear burst into flame. Not ordinary fire, but cold, blue flame that left no smoke, only silence. When it ended, nothing remained. No ashes, no thread. Just the circle of ash now broken. The woman nodded once, then turned away. It was done. The silence that returned to the house was not like before. It was deeper, softer, the kind of silence that brought peace instead of dread. There were no more growls, no more cold spots. The walls no longer whispered. The air was still, and for the first time in weeks it felt safe. Lily began to heal. Her eyes, once shadowed and tired, slowly regained their light. She laughed again, first in small bursts, then freely. She no longer clung to anything at bedtime. Her sleep became restful. The dark circles faded. She returned to her toys, to her books, to her drawings. Mr. Brownie's name was never spoken again. It was as if she had forgotten him completely. Eliza and Mark tried to move forward. They cleaned the house thoroughly, not to erase the past, but to reclaim their space. They lit candles in the evening, played soft music again, cooked meals that filled the home with warmth. But something inside them had changed. They carried the memory of those nights quietly, like a shadow that never truly disappeared. Sometimes Eliza would wake in the middle of the night and check the monitor, even though Lily was sleeping soundly. Sometimes Mark would stand outside her room just to listen for a sound he hoped never to hear again. They had survived something most would never believe, something that left no proof behind. Only the certainty of what they had seen. The historian never contacted them again. The woman in the woods vanished as quickly as she had come into their lives. But the peace she helped restore stayed. The bear was gone, its power broken. Whatever had lived within it was no longer part of their world. Still, in quiet moments, when the wind pressed against the windows or the trees swayed a little too hard, they would pause. They would remember. And they would hold each other a little tighter. If this story moved you, if it kept you listening all the way to the end, consider subscribing to our channel for more powerful and haunting tales. Every story we share is crafted to make you feel, to make you wonder, and sometimes to make you look twice at the world around you. Stay curious, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next story.